All right. Hello there. I'm Dr. John McDougall, and most of you know that not only am I interested in taking care of patients, what I've done for such a long time, and you've been there at drmcdougall.com, but I've developed a passion over the last 18 years for the climate. Why? Because my first grandchild was born 18 years ago. And I've been searching for all kinds of solutions. And I tell you, every solution I've come up with, we'll go into a lot of them that are talked about by the populace on how to solve it. It has come down with the answer, it's just too late, John. And even the efforts I'm trying to make into changing people's diet to reduce the CO2 production, which I think I have a valid reason to do. I mean, we got to fix that part too. It's still not enough soon enough. But as life has it, I get shown some wonderful things. And one of the things I was exposed to in a kind of a circuitous way was Dr. Yi Tao. And I don't know too much about him, but I bet by the end of this presentation, you're going to want to know more about him. And you can learn about him by going to YouTube and see his various presentations to scientists, to the United Nations climate change meetings. The man has been a lot of places, but he hasn't had a chance to talk to you yet. You as people who are interested in your lives, very intelligent people, and some with some really important resources. And so that's why I brought Dr. Yi Tao to talk to us about his plan. And it's just so exciting. I'll tell you, since I've heard about you and gotten into it, Dr. Tao, I've had a whole different attitude about life, and I hope we can instill that in other people. I know when my grandchildren, and they range from 6 to 18, when they hear about this, and they'll all understand it, they're going to stop asking questions like, what am I going to do? Because they're talking about this in their schools. How am I going to have children? How am I going to marry? How am I, with the correctly dismal outlook we have, the kids already know. So to this presentation, I'm going to show first to them. So plan on it. You're talking to a 6 to 18-year-old.
Okay.
I'm not probably much smarter. Hey, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak with your family and also your audience and your friends. So I'm trained as a scientist, and I'm Chinese Canadian. So my family moved to actually US first when I was 12, upstate New York. So we spent a couple of years there before my family moved to Montreal. So in Montreal, I was very fortunate to have met excellent science teachers, very devoted science teachers who would come in at 7 a.m. in the morning to give extra classes to those who would want to listen and just learn on their own. So I became very interested in physics and chemistry in high school and participated in the International Chemistry Olympiad back in 2004. And after that, I went to college, majored in chemistry, biochemistry, and then for a PhD, I switched field and became an experimental physicist. So I was on this very smooth career path towards another professor in university, and I was basically in a similar position at Harvard until I really became fully aware of the climate crisis through the work of Dr. McPherson.
Okay.
Guy McPherson.
Well, interestingly enough, that's how I got to you, was through Guy McPherson. So, I know he's a little dismal about what's going on, but it certainly served a purpose there.
Yeah, Dr. McPherson is very, what would say on one of the more extreme end of views among scientists. Yeah. But he has excellent intuition about how things are going from his training as an ecologist. And the general predictions are correct. We are, on track to disaster and very likely functional extinction in a not too long distant future if we really didn't get global warming under control. So basically, that's how I became, first of all, interested or shocked, let's say. So his initial messages really shocked me. I was in disbelief. I didn't really believe what he was talking about, but it was so shocking that it prompted me to really look into literature myself. So I spent, a year or so just looking into different fields, including climate science, ecology, animal tolerance to heat and CO2, etc. And after my own assessment of the literature, encompassing sometimes even more paper than maybe Guy has been sharing with the public, I was basically came to the same conclusion. We're in very deep trouble. So on multiple fronts. So that's when, as like many people, myself included, we enter into a state of despair and also grief. But then after that period, where you really accept your limited existence on this beautiful planet, you have to do something with your life. And what joy would be to leverage all the privilege and learning that I had received as a scientist to do something that can only add benefit and good to this world. So that's why I switched my field, basically turned my lab upside down from the original nanoscience, applied physics engineering research to use essentially the same tools, same skill set to tackle climate change from the perspective of a physicist and a material scientist. So around 2018, 2019, we made the switch. And since then, we have become a nonprofit organization currently collaborating with several research groups around the US and also civilian organizations in India trying to apply and understand the local impact of these MEER reflectors on how they can strongly cool the local environment and how eventually it's possible to scale that up to fully rebalance the energy imbalance that's currently driving global warming.
Well, before we go on, I want to, you say you're a nonprofit. That means you need to raise money. And people need to become aware of how to get a hold of you. And if they like what we have to say over the next hour, then what you do is you go to MEER, MEER.org. And that's a place to donate. And that where you'd like to have their attention as far as learning and trying to help. You're also taking volunteers, aren't you?
Yes, we're taking volunteers. So we do need very dedicated people because like my time and also the core leadership team's time is limited. So we need the really dedicated individuals at this moment for several key positions. So for example, we need the legal help, the lawyers who would be willing to help us on that front. And also academics and students who just want to learn. We have ongoing research projects. They're progressing a bit slower than compared to university lab because people are not full-time and they're not paid. But people who do participate in the research have moved on, many of them, to very good careers. So for example, two of our recent high school graduates got into Harvard. So we are very proud of their accomplishment. And the college kids also, many are moving on to PhD programs around the country. So it's a win-win situation. We get some contribution from the youth, the message gets spread, and we're producing the next generation of scientists, engineers who will be in the field tackling the problem.
And I guess it wouldn't hurt to get some money, would it?
Never hurts, yeah.
Okay, so it's MEER, MEER.org, and you can learn more about Dr. Tao's work, as well as you can learn what the rest of the organization is doing. I'd like to hear, could you, we said the word, dismal, that the future looks dismal. Can you just kind of start by addressing the approaches that most people are taking toward solving the climate crisis, including myself, and why it's going to fall short before we get on to how we really have a practical, doable way to take care of this problem. So let's start with, where's everybody else going? Because I know they're wrong. I mean, after listening to you listening to Guy McPherson and a few other people, there's just too much CO2 in the atmosphere. But, they're going to carbon capture it, and McDougall's going to get you to become a vegan. And, why I'm not wasting my time, I know, and we got to stop the production of CO2. We do, for sure.
Yeah, so I think it's just intuitive. We created this problem by emitting CO2. It's like if you left the tap on and water is overflowing in the sink and the flooding, of course, the first reaction is to go turn off the tap. But now you have got water on your wooden floor, turning off the sink by itself will not solve that problem. So you need also to deal with that problem using a different method. So it's a bit like the excess heating that we have generated as a result of what's already existing CO2 in the atmosphere. So the heating debt from existing emissions has not been fully paid. And we're looking at anywhere from 1 to 3 degrees of additional warming due to existing CO2 that's out there. And part of that warming is temporarily masked because current burning is also generating pollution, which is preventing some of the sunlight that would have otherwise hit Earth from hitting the Earth and generating excess heating.
Could you go into that for just a minute? Because I don't think I really understand the fact that actually the carbon producing industries are keeping us from disaster today. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. So when you burn fossil fuel, there's CO2 emitted, but there's also the production of nitrogen oxides because at very high temperatures, say in engines or in furnaces, the temperature is so high that nitrogen becomes reactive and combines with oxygen to produce these nitrogen oxides. There's also unspent fuel and also in some cases, sulfur content from coal. So all these chemicals get discharged, and under the action of sunlight is a form of energy. These molecules can further rearrange and react with each other. And many of them can coagulate into small particles, a few on the order of tens to hundreds of nanometer to microns in size. These little dust particles, if you will, are able to interact with the photons. So light hit them and get bounced back and sometimes get absorbed, but very often just get diverted to a different direction. So they're like little shiny floating disco balls in the air, and they are blocking a fraction of sunlight from reaching the Earth. So if you look at documentaries on India or Pakistan, where it's very, very highly polluted from heavy burning of coal, you would see that the sun and the sky is rather grayish, and it's not very bright. That's because a lot of the light has been shielded away from reaching ground, and also the direction of the light has been scrambled to different directions. So that's why it looks hazy when you look at the sky that's supposed to be blue due to not many photons coming in from that direction. But because there are so many of these little scattering particles, light gets passed around, so they're coming to you from very many different directions. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, it makes all sense. In other words, we have a little blanket that's protecting us. And if we stop the production of fossil fuels today, that blanket would be gone in just a few days, wouldn't it?
Yes, exactly. And COVID-19 back in 2020 actually offered a rare opportunity for climate scientists to look at exactly what happens when you impose shutdowns of entire regions and countries. And the results has been now published in about a dozen peer-reviewed papers. There's a couple more that I checked maybe a couple of weeks ago, but on the order of maybe 15 papers. But they unanimously confirm that there's more light reaching the Earth as a result of clearing up the sky. And they all confirm an increasing temperature of the Earth as a result of more light reaching ground. And the magnitude of the temperature increase has been observed to be a fraction of a degree Celsius, roughly 1 degree Fahrenheit over China. That really instituted the most severe of lockdowns.
We only have
very comparable. Yeah.
I would say well, people should know we only have 1 and 1.5 or 2 degrees before the game's over. So allowing that at 1 degree increase is not something we want to do. I think the other good example is volcanoes. Where they put particulate matter up and they've cooled the temperature from the volcanic dust. So, I think it's important for people to understand there are lots of reasons why we need to take your approach over. Not that we shouldn't dump the carbon. We got to get off fossil fuels. We've got to change our diet. Absolutely crucial.
Yes.
We've got to solve the problem now. And you consider this one way of looking at it is as solving the carbon problem, but the other way of looking at it, and people need to be real stink as you listen to this lecture. Getting rid of the carbon is one thing, but getting rid of the heat is what Dr. Tao is all about. And can you give us some really good basic talk on how we do that?
Yeah, so you're exactly right that there's actually 2 problems. One is the continued production of carbon for basically solving the problem of energy provisioning. So right now we're provisioning our energy through dirty means. So that problem needs to be addressed. But the other problem, climate change and global warming problem, is in energy terms a bigger problem. So what do I mean by that? So when you burn, say, a liter or gallon of fossil fuel, you produce a certain amount of heat. So we can actually aggregate the global consumption of burning and put an amount of heat or power to it. And that number is 18 terawatt. So that's how much power is right now, every moment being generated, because world is still functioning, civilization is still turning and running. So we can also measure how much heat, net energy, is accumulating in the Earth system as a result of global warming that we created. And that number is 1,000 to 1,500 terawatt. So it's roughly almost 100 times bigger a problem than the relatively small challenge of clean energy provisioning. So it would be wrong to think, okay, solving this small problem will solve that big giant that's now independently wreaking havoc around the ecosystem and on Earth. So making that conceptual distinction, I think, is very important.
So go ahead.
It also makes it clear that we really need something rather magical to tackle such a gigantic global warming power problem. Because if you think about your air conditioning unit at home, you need to feed it electricity for it to work for you. And when it works, it transfers thermal energy from inside the room to outside of the room. So we can actually very precisely calculate what's the efficiency defined as a ratio of 2 energy or 2 power inputs. So the amount of heat that's removed for every unit of electrical energy that's fed into the machine. And for a typical air conditioning unit, it's about 3 or 4. So for every joule or every unit of energy you feed in, you move 3 or 4 joules of energy out outside. It's not bad. But if we're thinking about an air conditioning unit for Earth, we need it to be so efficient that for every unit of energy we feed in, it needs to remove at least 100 units of heat out. And that's assuming we somehow devoted 100% of our energy to just tackle global warming, which is obviously not practically feasible. So let's say we're very optimistic. We're somehow devoting, say, 5% of our total energy just to tackle the environment, global warming. Then we essentially need an efficiency that's with ratio that's 10,000, or or basically efficiency that's 100,000% efficient. And when you use this very basic metric of efficiency as a cutoff to assess different proposals, you quickly find essentially the entirety of proposed solutions fall far short of what's required to really control global warming because of the objective fact of how much the power is that's driving the warming.
Well, I think people have probably got enough information on how what we're doing right now is going to be ineffective. But you've got a plan, and if I didn't think it was feasible and something that we really have to pay attention to, I wouldn't waste your time. But let's go on to the heating part, because that's what you're really about. Since we can't fix the CO2 part at least fast enough, or with the will of the people, let's just put it that way. How do we fix the heat of this planet? How do we keep this from going 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees or 4 degrees, whatever it is, to an unsustainable temperature? How do we do that?
Great. So in order to stop any further heating, what you really needed to do is to ensure that the same amount of energy comes into the Earth system than is leaving it. So right now we have an excess of, we mentioned, 1,000 terawatt. So the question is it possible to have a cooling infrastructure that provides 1,000 terawatt of cooling? And the way we think that can be feasible is to have basically mirrors or surface-based reflectors that reflect away a portion of the incoming solar radiation away at ground level. So nothing is emitted into the atmosphere. And the reason why we really want to implement these reflectors at ground is they can be combined with different types of devices that provide strong local benefit. So for example, in many agricultural settings in, say, Southern Europe, or even warm parts, hot parts of the United States, the temperature outside and especially solar irradiance around noon, is too much for many plants to handle. So farmers resort to partially reflecting sheetings or coverings and also nets, colored nets, in order to absorb a portion of the radiation so that sensitive plants like tomatoes, etc., can actually survive underneath. So in the agricultural setting, there's actually too much solar resource that is currently necessary for optimal yields. So instead of absorbing that energy in colored nets and producing local air heating, why not just use mirrors to reflect away that portion of the light back into space? So it's many people are confused and they might ask, what about the CO2? Wouldn't the CO2 prevent light from being reflected? So here we have to talk a bit of the science. So the atmosphere is rather transparent to sunlight. That's why you can see the sun, and that's why you can have light at ground level. It's only when the light is transformed into heat and then re-emitted as a long wave infrared radiation does the CO2 become a blanket for that form of long wave radiation. For the visible light, CO2 is rather transparent from the perspective of sunlight. That's why before you prevent the light to heat conversion process, and then you send them right back. So it's like shutting down the sink of water. It's a perfect analogy in that case. So yeah, I like to see if I've been clear.
Okay, so we've got one mirror. We reflect the light back to wherever, outer space. We get rid of it. We get rid of that energy. But that's one mirror. I mean, how much of the planet are we going to have to cover? And then I want to hear about the practicality of covering the planet with mirrors.
And so it turns out that we only need to perturb roughly by 1% of the solar radiation that's reaching ground in order to more or less stabilize current climate. And of course, 1% of Earth's surface area is a huge area. But assuming we're to burn fossil fuel at current rate and hopefully winding down quickly, assume we're to continue current burning rates, we need to cover that 1% surface by the end of the century if we were to stay more or less at current climates. So that translates to about the 10 to 15% coverage of the current agricultural field by the end of the century. Obviously, that's still a huge area, but the good news is that this level of coverage might actually boost agricultural yields in many regions because of the problem of water stress and over temperature that we mentioned. So sometimes, a larger area, a slightly reduced amount of sunlight will lower local temperatures, keeping it to below 30 degrees Celsius, which is optimal for plant growth. And also, when you reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the ground, you also proportionally reduce water usage and reduce water stress. So that could be a huge benefit for adaptation and the local resilience of agricultural communities.
All right, well, you said 1% by the end of the century. That's 80 years away. What do we do over the next 10 years or 8 years? Okay, is this feasible to build enough reflectors so that by 2030, which is, is now becoming one of the key landmarks as far as when we've got a problem that we can't solve. Can you do that?
So assuming everything, proceeds according to the ideal timetable, what we need to do is not to build everything out by 2030. What we need to do is to achieve a production rate such that your annual production of mirrors provides the same cooling as the heating induced by your annual emissions. So in my very pessimistic estimate of continuing until the end of the century, that's assuming we were to continue current emission rates. Of course, if we were somehow able to decarbonize by the 2070s, then we could eventually slowly ramp down the required mirror production.
So you think it is feasible anyways. So with these mirrors, on your site, people are going to see a mirror that's about 2 by 3 feet in size. But you also have some representations that cover a whole field. where are we going to put these mirrors? Are we, people don't, I don't want one over my home. Where do you plan on putting them?
So in a variety of places, we mentioned the application in agricultural setting. We can also place them over reservoirs and the water transportation aqueducts to prevent loss of freshwater in evaporation. We could also have strategically placed mirrors over, say, coral reefs as a way to prevent coral bleaching, to protect the very thermally vulnerable ecosystems. We could also, in urban setting, make your deck MEER tiled. That would make it really cool in the summer and also much more enjoyable visually compared to a white roof or white painted deck because of the very different way light is reflected by white paint versus mirror. So in the case of white paint, it's like going outside during in a snowy day that's really sunny. Light photon is hitting you from everywhere because it's being scrambled everywhere. Whereas in the case of mirrored decking, if you just had a shade, you'll be perfectly shielded from all solar radiation. So it's a much more enjoyable experience.
I think we, of course, have some people that are interested in animal rights. And right now they're thinking, all that sunlight, all those mirrors, is that going to hurt the birds? And how about the airplane pilots that are flying by? So it's going to be a problem to reflect all that sunlight back into where they're at.
No, it won't be a problem and barely perceptible. The reason is, even assuming that we are covering 100% of the surface, which is technically not possible, the most you can do is to double the amount of the sunlight that day. So you'll be, in that case, that's the worst case scenario. It's like a very bright day for the bird or pilot. But in practical situations, you probably cover maybe 10%. So it's a small percentage increase over the ambient visible photons that's already bouncing around. So that's completely not an issue. I think people are worried because when they think of mirrors and the fields of mirrors, they think of concentrating solar power plants, which strategically and purposefully focus the reflected rays to a single spot in space. So that hot spot becomes really dangerous for birds who are oblivious to its presence and they get fried flying over it.
And that would be a good
mirrors.
That'd be a good way of making energy for people to focus a few of the mirrors on one single spot. We could boil some water. We could, have turbine plants, and we solve a lot of the energy problem when we did that. Okay, all right. If I put some of these mirrors, and that's what we're talking about, mirrors. If I put them over, say, deserts, or I put them over oceans, or I put them over, we're not going to, just a small amount of cropland. Does it make any difference? And what are you going to do about it?
So of course they will make a difference globally wherever you put them, and the differential benefit will be a function of your background. So let's say for the same area put over ocean, will have a much larger cooling impact than one that's put over a desert because the ocean is much darker to start with. So when you're swapping out a chunk of very dark absorbing ocean to mostly reflective mirror, the change is much larger than compared to already bright sand. So the ratio is roughly a factor of 2 in aerial efficiency. So there are these differences, but also it's much harder to put things into the ocean without them, crumbling apart and being destroyed by hurricanes. And also it's very difficult to keep the mirrors clean in deserts without so that's why the optimal case for large scale scaling is in the agricultural setting because there's irrigation, there's area with the rain. We observed in our preliminary experiments that rainfall naturally cleans the near surface. So that's really the ideal locations.
Well, it sounds like you've been asked every question, you got an answer. How about latitude? Is it going to make any difference whether we start this project around the equator or at higher latitudes?
So it turns out that in the case of MEER, over a very broad range of latitudes, the global cooling efficiency is very comparable. Okay. The reason is that in higher latitudes, you simply tilt your mirrors to have a larger projected surface exposure to the sun. So integrated over the seasons, years, it's very comparable. So it's really, now we're trying to fully understand local impact and the benefits, because for something this grand, we really need participation from everybody. And it has to be grassroots and democratic, and decision has to be made by informed citizens and people from around the world who have personal experience with these devices. You cannot really make this decision when you don't really understand the process or the underlying mechanisms.
Well, before we get into why has not this caught on more than it should, let's talk about the cost and where we get the materials to make these mirrors, and what can we do it, or technology today, or we have to invent new technology to make these millions of mirrors. And I just wondered, it was a figure that I heard correctly that it's only 10% of the agricultural land that you have to cover with mirrors to accomplish what you want to accomplish immediately. That's about right.
Yes, so that's about right. Yeah. That's about right. And
so we still grow potatoes and tomatoes, and we got plenty of land left, right?
Well, actually, it's also possible to create a new arable land if you have sufficient MEER coverage, because if you can reduce the local temperature and also reduce how much evaporation is going on, maybe you can moisten the soil in previously unused land as well. So land will not be an issue. And using agriculture as a base also enables the widest, more uniform sort of implementation, which would have less of a sharp disturbance to circulation patterns. So there is a more complex science that we don't want to get into today, but just from first principles, if you can distribute them evenly, that's a much safer way to do things than to just concentrate them, say, in the Sahara Desert, say, on Earth.
How are you going to make your mirrors? I don't know anything about making a mirror. Could you explain how simple I can do it and cost efficient?
So it's something that unfortunately cannot be really just made in your backyard or your garage. It takes a small town to invest in some equipment, maybe I'd say 100,000, to be able to make your own mirrors. So there's different approaches, and in the initial days of the project, we wanted to make everything out of glass. The reason is that glass is such a stable material, in air, and when it interfaces with soil, as long as there's no vandalism going on, they shouldn't really, deteriorate. And there's data for multi-decadal stability without measurable degradation in the solar industry for these glass mirrors. So we know they work, and existing technology already exists. So you may run into a little bit of a scaling problem if you made everything from glass. So we calculated we maybe have to ramp up global glass production by like a 20-30 fold to meet the demand, and that's too much of a demand. So now we have rethought the problem, and we realized that why don't we also solve the plastic pollution and landfill problem at the same time? So we did calculations, and it turns out these PET, polyethylene terephthalate bottles that we landfill every year is more than sufficient for making all the reflective sheeting based on polymer and aluminum that we would need to completely cancel current global warming from the annual emissions. And the amount of aluminum cans that we're landfilling every year is 700% of what's needed for our project. So we more or less satisfy a big part of our project need just using currently discarded resources. So, and we also throw away 150 megaton of glass of various colors in all the containers every year. And that's already enough for like 10% of current project needs. So resource and energy provisioning for the MEER framework doesn't seem to be a problem. The problem is that it's not making a profit for people, and we are actively trying to make sure that that's not the case.
Well, I understand, like in everything, it's the money, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. Is the money and how we get people motivated to think about something else besides the money, like how about your children and grandchildren? So if I was going to make glass today, I would take is it made out of sand?
Glass, well, it really depends on what's a grade of
glass. Take out of something in the ground.
Yeah, silica, sand. Yeah. You can also use silica rocks if needed, because everything gets molten down anyways.
They're cheap, abundant, but it's going to cost me some energy to turn this sand or rocks into nice looking mirrors. What's the calculation as far as heat saved versus heat produced when you take and apply carbon technology to making the mirrors?
So because we want to develop a really feasible technology, regardless of how energy provisioning happens. So we estimate that based on current fossil fuel methods for glass production, we need the 1.3% of global energy consumption to power the MEER project. So basically, the ratio is order of 1 to 100 heat cancellation for CO2 emission associated, with the productions. And that's assuming we were to make, say, what's needed for the glass using fossil fuel energy like methane, etc. It's also possible to make the glass, giving enough research support, using solar heat. That's been demonstrated, and there's a successful reaction that took place at the PSU in Switzerland in 2018. The group demonstrated that you can indeed melt glass using just the solar energy. So once we make that jump, then associated emissions would drop way below what's really need to be considered as a hurdle. Right now, it's like 1.3% based on just the methane burning furnace. And the methane, we can get the required methane if we managed our landfills better. If we really sorted out the plastic and the aluminum cans and glass and then the food scraps, let's just put that into fermentation digesters and use that methane to make the mirrors from the glass, the plastic, and the aluminum cans. So we estimate 50 to 100% of energy need can be secured just from food, fugitive methane emissions from landfills.
I think nothing if you took all those cows off the planet. Okay, maybe we should keep the cows for the methane production. I'm Dr. John McDougall, and my website is drmcdougall.com. The most important for you to know is our guest, which is Yi Tao, PhD doctor, who's a scientist. But I think more than that, you're hearing somebody who's dedicated his life, every molecule in his brain, to every cell in his brain, to solving a project that everybody seems to be concerned about and is working on. And the website for you to visit is MEER, MEER.org. And these people need help. They need the word spread, to say the least. They use a little bit of money too. Anyway, I hope you're finding this as interesting as I do. There are a few more things I really would like to explore with you, but so far I have to tell you, you have more answers, and they sound like right ones, and you can communicate them in a way that I think most of us can believe it and understand it. I have one question as we get back into this that I was confused a little bit before about, and maybe you can make this translation to me. One of the things that was most scary to me, and I know this isn't your work, but you may have heard it too, is that what's happening on the planet today is the equivalent of like 5 to 10 Hiroshima bombs hitting the planet every second. Have you ever heard that figure, or is that just way off?
Yes, I think that's correct, or even a bit more than that. I have to check the numbers, but I only know it's basically the 1,000 terawatt that I was mentioning.
You're talking terawatts, but these folks know Hiroshima bombs.
Yeah. Yes. So tera is 10 to the 12 watts.
Yeah,
so it's
right.
a big
It's
number. So it's roughly 1 million billion watts. 1
Wow.
million billion watts.
So we have a lot of energy to reflect back, but we obviously
That's
have
right.
too much heat. That's what we're talking about, is dealing with the heat rather than the CO2 problem, which appears to be, as far as the time frame we have, insolvable. And what we're talking about is dealing with the heat. And what do you do with the heat? Well, you reflect it back to outer space. And it sounds like a really practical way to do it. All right, so you're going to manufacture the mirrors inexpensively from, I know you thought about the most abundant trash that we have out there, and we'll take the sunlight as a source of energy when we get that fully developed. Right now, we could do it feasibly with our current fossil fuels, so we can run the factories to make the mirrors. Have you started this at all? Have you covered any decent sized landscapes with mirrors that you feel you've gained some information from?
So as we're speaking, we're actually trying to implement the medium-sized experiment, roughly the size of a football field on that scale. Actually, 2 of those both are in New Hampshire, one in Plymouth, the other in Concord Community College on their campus. So the one in Plymouth is actually right next to the municipal airport. We got approval from the aviation folks because it's not really a concern for the pilots, as we just explained before.
Yeah.
So if we come back later this summer, we'll have footage and videos documenting progress on those fields. And the goal for the summer is to really understand how local cooling and moisture retention scales with your aerial coverage on a essentially backyard scale. So each of our plots will be about 30 or 40 feet by 40 feet. So that's the scale we're talking about. And we will have 8 of those plots in various configurations set up.
Good. But you also had some thoughts that intrigued me because I'm an ocean person. Scuba diving, windsurfing, sailboats, just love the ocean. And of course, the oceans are disappearing with 90% of the fish gone and the coral reefs bleached, and the shells up here, the different types of clams and mollusks we have are not be able to reproduce. You have some answers about how to deal with the acidification of our oceans. And I'd like to hear about that.
Okay, yes. So obviously, addressing the heat is the most urgent task we need to accomplish. But CO2 also causes another problem, which fortunately for us is slightly less urgent by maybe about 30, 40 years. But eventually, we might get to a point where the acidification of oceans, especially during diurnal and seasonal swings, become too acidic for many species that needs to make calcium carbonate as part of the structure or shells. So it turns out that when you are trying to do carbon capture, there are several steps that are energy intensive. One of which is to separate out, say, the CO2 molecules from the remaining air molecules. CO2 happens at a rather dilute concentration. So any effort to concentrate or purify things is really energy intensive. So that's why land or air-based capture is not feasible at all because of the huge energy cost for this purifying step. The good thing about the ocean is that it has selectively dissolved the CO2 out from the air, because CO2 is more soluble than, say, oxygen or nitrogen because it can chemically react with water to form carbonic acid. So the ocean, by virtue of the chemical properties of water and also the huge expanse surface area, has done the concentration step for humans for free. Now, are there still better, more concentrated forms in the ocean? Of course, you can find, anything that's organic is composed of, carbon structures. But out of everything, the shells of mollusks, of bivalves, they are like 40% just carbon dioxide by virtue of the chemical formula calcium carbonate, CaCO3. So it's basically CaO, calcium oxide, plus CO2. So that's by far the densest form of CO2 that you can find in the ocean. So when it's dense, it's easy to transport because transportation costs energy. And if it's embedded within, say, a type of food, very low on the trophic level on the food chain, like mussels and scallops, then the transportation is for free because there's a commercial value in the meat part. So we solve both the concentration and the transportation part. Now, of course, we cannot just dump and bury the shells. Eventually, we may start to deplete the calcium concentration in the oceans to have another problem. So we could then somehow selectively return the calcium into the ocean. Then we would be conceptually using the calcium as a pump or carrier of CO2 from the oceans through the organisms to our dinner tables, and then somehow separating out the CO2 part. So to do that process, we do need to input energy. If we do that in the form of a solar heat, then that would be one sustainable way to power this process in a complete closed cycle. So the environmental conditions in calcium concentration never gets perturbed. And if we return the calcium locally close to the aquaculture facilities where these bivalves are growing, we're also buffering these organisms from potential acidification, because you can create pH gradients, basically varying pH in the ocean depending on where you're adding a little bit of base. So things take time to mix. So close to where you release this, that area will be more protected from acidification. So it's yet another adaptation strategy in addition to a very efficient CO2 capture mechanism. That's much more feasible.
So I'm pretty clear on how we're going to take care of the heat just by reflecting the sunlight. That's real easy to understand. And the stuff about the oceans is really important to me, but we'll have to talk about that some more. Are there other areas of environmental destruction that you're passionate about? I want you to have a chance to talk about this, because obviously you're a man who's thought about this problem a lot. In fact, I don't even know how you sleep. And there's other things that you have some ideas about before we get into why not? I mean, why isn't everybody talking about that? We'll get into that next. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
I think the most environmental stressors is heat and drought. Yeah. And those are basically what we have been trying to address using MEERs. But of course, there's these tipping points in the Arctic, in the Amazons, that's turning formerly carbon sinks into net sources. Yeah. And also the wildfires. And one potentially relevant idea is to basically implement MEER arrays in fire lanes as a way to increase local moisture of fire lanes to make them more effective, and also local lower the local temperature of these to give firefighters more time to control fire. So that's one idea that potentially is useful for addressing forest fires. Yeah,
we could also bring home the troops, and they can start fighting forests instead of people.
And hurricanes, and hurricanes, and because hurricanes are driven also by heat, right? So if there's enough research funding to make marine-based MEER arrays to really strategically cool down regions close to the coast, that's really hurting our eastern southern seaboard, that would be a good use.
It's just plain and simple. We have to get rid of the heat, and I do understand that now, and I didn't before. So you've made this a real goal of mine. What I've understood before, and I bought an electric car, and I used to believe in carbon capture until I discovered how much that would cost. And let's see, cars, we make a lot of money on those, and carbon capture, I'm sure that they don't do that for free. It's the money, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's these startups are made because they can, at least in short term, make a profit. And it's a process that works maybe in the lab, but many of these have not really done the assessment of their efficiency within the context of the level of efficiency that's needed to really tackle climate change. So we have done the calculation for direct air capture, and it falls short by more than 1 order of magnitude from being able to, in principle, be able to solve climate change. So, but yet on website of these companies, they still advertise, donate to reverse climate change. So it's a false advertising.
Yeah, well, there's been a campaign out there to stop this carbon capture nonsense. So I think the general public is aware of this is not going to work out. But it's I ask myself, it's the bankers, it's the people that own the big businesses. Don't they have children too and grandchildren too? I mean, what is making an extra $1 billion? How important is that to say one of their children or grandchildren? We're talking about all of them. Do you see any financial pressure on yours and what you're trying to do one way or the other? Because I have to guess that if your ideas really catch on, Dr. Yitao, that you're going to feel a considerable amount of financial pressure. At least people, I actually looked for people who said that there were disadvantages or adverse effects to your method, and I couldn't find any yet. So you have not become popular enough.
Yeah. Well, I guess that'll be a good spot to be on. I mean, we
Yeah.
need to absolutely to identify, problems with any part of the proposal and just see whether these are fundamental issues or things that can be addressed by engineering.
Well, I haven't seen anything yet. Until I
Yeah.
do, I'm going to keep pursuing this until I find out otherwise. But
Uh-huh.
I do see any way I mean, besides the obvious, it'd be nice to say to the butterflies and, the sharks and the lions and people too. I mean, that's the obvious thing. It's our home at stake. Can you think of any short-term advantages to people? And again, I'm talking about money by your efforts. How do you make another fortune off of correcting the problem?
I mean, of course, in the short term, like let's say somehow MEER was formed as a for-profit company and we were never disclosed any of this idea, then by the necessity of having to feed people and by the very real heat stress extreme event that's decimating crops, farmers will be forced to use similar adaptation technologies just to keep production going. So, and the scale of agriculture, for one, is a pretty big business. So, of course, there's like profits to be made.
Yeah.
And the other, is energy production, obviously, and MEERs can certainly be used to make renewable production much more efficient.
Well, there has to be some people have to get in there either to produce MEERs or to whatever. So there has to be some short-term profit in there that's pretty important, so that they can fight against it and cause change. I'm not saying that their change can't happen. It will happen. We have no choice. The question is, will good win against evil? It's just that's been the history of mankind, hasn't it? So I hope that you become popular enough so that you find your detractors. When you do, I want you to call me and I'll tell you how to deal with some of them.
Yeah, sure. I'll get advice from you.
Yeah,
once
really.
that happens.
Well, as this is Dr. Yi Tao, and his website is MEER, MEER.org. And did I get it all right, or is there something that you would like to add to how to get in contact with you?
That's correct. It's MEER.org, MEER.org. And it's not just my website, it's a website for the project. Yeah, and there's participants from all walks of life and also research universities and also civilian organizations, humanitarian organizations. So it's just a website for the project.
I think sharing the credit fits with your personality. So I understand where you're coming from, and it is a lot of people, and it's a nice website, but it's your genius. Don't let me embarrass you by saying that, but your genius and your dedication that's going to make this happen. And I'm excited to watch it. I hope you'll give me some more time as our audience looks at your work and has a chance to understand it, feel like I did, a little bit of optimism for the future. I hope you'll join us again and explain more about your projects and how things are going.
Yeah, certainly. We like to engage with the citizenry and also kids. You mentioned you have grandkids.
Yeah.
And I was just interviewed by a reporter from Channel 12 News in somewhere in Arizona, and he also has kids, and many are really concerned about climate change in their future. I think it's a motivation for them to learn the science and really become leaders and activists, and so.
Well, we've added at least a spark to this, to this effort, and I for sure we caused more than a few people to want to know more about it. But you have a lot more to tell us, and I look forward to the next time we can get together. And I really hope you become too busy to get together with us in the near future. but it would be from my selfish point of view, I'd really love to talk to you again. And I appreciate everything you're doing. And I hope you have the energy to keep up with it. From talking from my point of view, you'll never quit. You'll never stop fighting.
Well, thanks for reaching out. We'll keep up the work.
All right. So that's Dr. Yi Tao. He's been able to spend a considerable amount of time with us. And the website is MEER.org. And I'm Dr. John McDougall, and my website is drmcdougall.com. but also my interest in diet and climate change. You'll find it at McDougallFoundation.org, McDougallFoundation.org. Thank you very much for spending some time with us. Thank you very much, Dr. Tao. It was a real pleasure. You made my day. Thank you.
Thank you. Very kind words.
Bye-bye.